Some men age like wine, others age like vinegar and passive aggression. Now here's the controversial part. Most of what makes a man wise in old age is what he stops saying. And yet the world keeps praising the loudest guy at the table, the one quoting stoic Instagram memes while quietly self-destructing. That's where we disagree. Welcome, friend, to Buddhist Wisdom for the Elderly, where we don't chase alpha energy, we sit with our ego in a rocking chair, sip tea with it, and ask why it's still yelling. In today's video, we're peeling back 9 phrases intelligent men never say. For each one, we'll show you what the phrase sounds like, why it hurts and usually backfires, a real or imagined story soaked in dark humor, and what to say instead if you'd rather die with grace than with a grudge. There's part 8, I deserve better, that you really don't want to miss. It reveals how entitlement sneaks into old age like high blood pressure, quiet, resentful, and ready to ruin dinner. But facing it might just make you free again. So like this video, hit subscribe, and help us reach 1,000 souls on the path. Let's keep creating wisdom for the ones no longer trying to impress, but still curious enough to evolve. Come on in. We've saved you a cushion. Part 1. I already know that the deadliest sentence in the room is the one that ends the conversation before it starts. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. Have you ever interrupted someone mid-sentence, not because you were in a hurry, but because you thought, I already know where this is going? Yeah, me too. And let me tell you, the worst part wasn't being wrong. It was realizing how many years I spent mistaking arrogance for wisdom, while my brain quietly stopped growing like a houseplant nobody watered. This one phrase, I already know that, is a bit like a do not disturb sign on the soul. It tells the world, my mind is closed, my ego is open, proceed with flattery. There's an old Zen story that goes like this. A young scholar visited a wise monk and started rattling off everything he knew about Buddhism, philosophy, and probably what he had for breakfast. The monk listened, silently. Then he poured him some tea. The cup filled and kept filling. Tea ran over the sides, onto the table, onto the floor. Still, the monk kept pouring. Stop, the scholar shouted. It's full. The monk smiled. Yes, like your mind. How can I pour anything in if there's no space? Now, if that scholar had been me at 45, I probably would have said, I know that story, and missed the point entirely. As we get older, something tricky happens. We don't just gather knowledge, we start clinging to it like old receipts we're afraid to throw away. Psychologists call it closure bias. It's when the brain gets addicted to certainty, to knowing, to being the wise one at the table. But here's the dark joke. The more we insist we know everything, the less our brain actually learns. This is especially true for older men who built their identities around being competent providers, fixers, leaders. So every time we say, I already know that, we're not flexing intelligence, we're announcing a cognitive retirement party. Balloons, cake, no new ideas allowed. In Buddhism, there's a concept called shoshin, or beginner's mind. It's the opposite of I already know that. It's the sacred discipline of seeing everything, even the familiar, as if for the first time. Thich Nhat Hanh once said that true understanding comes from looking at your life like it's a cup of tea. Freshly poured, not yesterday's brew. And frankly, after 60, the only thing worse than stale tea is a stale mind. Beginner's mind isn't naive. It's humble. It doesn't pretend not to know. It just refuses to assume it knows everything. And that's what makes it so rare and so wise. Years ago, I was sitting with a mentor who wanted to explain a process I'd done 100 times. I cut him off with a confident, yeah, I already know that. He paused, looked at me with a stillness that should have been my clue. He said nothing more. Later that night, I realized I hadn't just interrupted him. I'd interrupted my own growth. I'd turned away a man's lived wisdom because I thought my experience was enough. Turns out I was wrong, and he was right. And the worst part? That lesson didn't come with a slap. It came with silence, which hurt a lot more. Every time we say, I already know that, we're closing the door not just on other people, but on ourselves. An intelligent man doesn't say, I already know. He says, what if there's more to this than I realized? He stays curious. He listens to the beginner, the broken, the child, the stranger, because he knows the truth. Wisdom isn't loud, it's spacious. And if you want to be someone worth listening to, start by listening, especially when your ego wants to interrupt. We're going to talk about another phrase that's been quietly ruining men's potential for centuries. It's the emotional version of a flat tire. It sounds like logic, but it's really fear. That's right, that's impossible. Let's puncture it. That's impossible. A fancy way of saying, I'm afraid, and I'd rather sound smart than vulnerable. Let's get real for a second. When a man over 60 says, that's impossible, he's rarely talking about physics. He's talking about his own comfort zone. Translated, it often means, that sounds hard, scary, or unfamiliar, and I'd like to shut this whole thing down before I have to feel anything new. And look, I get it. At a certain age, we've all had our hearts broken, our knees replaced, and our hopes politely escorted out the back door of some corporate building. So we build walls. But the tricky part is this. Walls don't just keep things out, they also keep you in. There was a guy in my neighborhood named Terry. Terry always wanted to learn piano. Every year after retirement, he'd say, maybe next year once things calm down. Mind you, he was 68, had no job, and things calming down meant I'm waiting until I have absolutely no pulse. One day someone gifted him an electric keyboard. He shook his head and said, well, too old to start now. That's impossible at my age. He died 2 years later. The keyboard stayed in the box. We gave it away at his estate sale, next to his untouched watercolor set, unread poetry books, and a closet full of what could have been. That's the tragedy of That's Impossible. It doesn't announce itself with drama. It just quietly waits until you're gone. In Buddhist psychology, aversion is one of the 3 poisons of the mind. It shows up in men like this. Nah, that won't work. Nah, I'd fail. Nah, it's too late. But what we're really saying is, I'm terrified of trying and being seen trying. The ego would rather look rational than risk looking alive. The Dalai Lama once said, it is not enough to be compassionate. We must act. But most of us don't even let ourselves imagine. And imagination, my friend, is where rebirth begins. Neurologically, people who challenge their beliefs age better. Their brains retain flexibility, that neuroplasticity and resilience. But the moment you say, that's impossible, your brain hears, we're done learning. Cancel all future surprises. Let entropy begin. It's like planting yourself in a rocking chair and saying, wake me when I'm dead. You don't need a PhD in psychology to know this. The men who die fastest aren't the sickest. They're the ones who gave up trying. Years ago, I got offered a chance to join a team building a wellness center in a rural town. No money. No time, no staff, just a few stubborn dreamers and some donated drywall. Every part of me said, this is doomed. But instead of saying that's impossible, I asked the question that changed my life. What's the next small step I can do today? 2 years later, that wellness center was hosting elder meditation circles, health screenings, and the kind of slow-breathing miracles no hospital ever tracked. Not because we were heroes, but because we said yes, when it would have been smarter to say no. So here's your wisdom injection, straight, no chaser. Intelligent men don't say, that's impossible. They say, let me look again. Because impossible things happen every day. A heartbroken man forgives his father. A widower learns to cook for one and smiles while doing it. A 79-year-old woman joins an improv group and becomes the funniest person in the room. And sometimes, just sometimes, a man decides that the next chapter of his life might actually be the most interesting. We dive into the most seductive lie a man tells when he's afraid to look in the mirror. That's not my fault. Stick around, we're just warming up. Part 3. That's not my fault. The favorite phrase of men who'd rather be right than free. Let me tell you something hard but liberating. Every time you say, that's not my fault, the universe quietly takes away your steering wheel. Blame feels good in the moment. It's warm, it's easy. It's like slipping into sweatpants after a long day of pretending to be emotionally available. But here's the problem. Blame doesn't build anything. It just helps you sit comfortably in the rubble of your own unconscious decisions. I once met a man, we'll call him Earl, who had 3 ex-wives, 2 estranged kids, and 1 consistent story. It wasn't my fault. Wife 1, too emotional. Wife 2, too ambitious. Wife 3, didn't appreciate a good man. You know who never showed up in the story? Earl. Not once did he say, maybe I could have done that better. He never examined the common denominator in every failed relationship. Himself. So he sat alone in a recliner that smelled like guilt and microwave meatloaf, wondering why the phone never rang on his birthday. Psychologists have long noticed that men over 60 sometimes struggle with feedback. Why? Because by then, our identity feels fixed. We've spent decades telling ourselves who we are. I'm the provider. I'm the fixer. I'm the strong one. So when life says, hey, maybe you messed that up, it doesn't feel like feedback. It feels like demolition. But here's the Buddhist twist. Nothing you truly are can be destroyed. Only illusions can. Buddhism teaches that you are not your past, but you are your choices right now. The moment you take responsibility, not in a self-punishing way, but in a soft, sober, present-moment way, you reclaim something precious. Agency. As Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh said, when you plant lettuce and it does not grow well, you don't blame the lettuce. You look for reasons. Perhaps it needs more sun, more water, or less fertilizer. You never blame the lettuce. But most men blame the lettuce. Or worse, they blame their wives, the government, or Mercury in retrograde. I once got into a ridiculous argument over cranberry sauce. Don't ask me why. It was the kind in the can. Someone didn't buy it. I flipped out, ruined the whole meal. Later that night, I told myself it wasn't my fault. I just hate change. But the truth is, I was stressed, lonely, and I turned a can of cranberry sauce into a battlefield so I wouldn't have to feel what was really hurting. That's not blame, that's honesty. And from honesty, healing can begin. They get to work. Every time you say, that's not my fault, you hand over your power like an expired credit card. But when you say, here's what I could have done differently, here's how I contributed, here's what I've learned, you reclaim your dignity, your spiritual manhood, and most importantly, your ability to change the ending of the story you're in. Because the real mark of intelligence isn't getting everything right. It's knowing how to take responsibility when you don't. We're heading into one of the most dangerous phrases an aging man can whisper to himself. I don't need any help. It sounds strong, but it might be the loneliest sentence ever spoken in silence. Part 4. I don't need any help. The manliest way to slowly drown while smiling and waving. You ever met a man in his 60s who's convinced he can still move a couch by himself? No warm-up, no plan, just pure optimism and a suspicious crunching sound from his lower spine. This is that man's theme song, I don't need any help. He says it when he's got groceries cutting off circulation in both arms. He says it when his marriage is falling apart, but he won't see a counselor. He says it when he's one YouTube tutorial away from electrocuting himself trying to fix a ceiling fan. On the surface, it sounds noble, strong, rugged, self-reliant. But underneath, it's just fear dressed in denim. I once knew a guy, we'll call him Hank, big guy, army vet, could open a pickle jar with his teeth. He slipped in the shower one morning, broke his hip, lay there for 2 hours trying to army crawl to the phone, pride dragging behind him like a wounded ego. When his daughter asked why he didn't call for help sooner, you know what he said? Didn't want to be a burden. Let me translate that. I'd rather suffer in silence than admit I'm human. And that, my friend, is the loneliest kind of masculinity. Buddhism teaches that interbeing is the nature of all things. You breathe because trees exhale. You live because others have fed, clothed, taught, and carried you. Thich Nhat Hanh called this the wisdom of no separate self. Yet somewhere around midlife, men start believing they must earn their right to exist by not needing anyone. But here's the kicker. Even the Buddha had a sangha, a spiritual community. Even he leaned on others, walked together, shared meals. If the enlightened one can ask for support, why are you still trying to fix your water heater alone? Social psychologists have shown that refusing help increases isolation, accelerates cognitive decline, and heightens the risk of depression in older adults, especially men. Because independence isn't the opposite of connection. It's a myth built by men who were taught that asking is weakness. Let me say that again. You're not weak because you need help. You're wise when you know when to ask for it. Years ago, I decided to fix myself without any support. No therapy, no conversations, just books and vague shame. I thought if I just figured it out in private, I could emerge like a spiritual butterfly and surprise everyone with my perfect, pain-free enlightenment. Spoiler alert, that's not what happened. What actually happened was I turned into a sleep-deprived man, whispering affirmations to a cold burrito at 2 a.m., wondering why I still hated myself. The turning point wasn't some breakthrough. It was a phone call to a friend. 3 words, I need help. And everything started to change. Wise men know they always could have. So the next time you're tempted to grunt out, I've got this. I'm fine. I don't need anyone. Ask yourself this. Are you saying that from strength or from a lifetime of conditioning that told you vulnerability was dangerous? Because the truth is, your strength isn't measured by what you carry. It's measured by who you let carry it with you. We're about to unpack one of the most socially acceptable death sentences a man can whisper with a shrug. I'm too old for that. But here's the twist. If you're still alive, you're not too old. You're just scared of being new again. Let's go there. Part 5. I'm too old for that. The most polite way to bury yourself before anyone has to do it for you. Let me ask you a brutally honest question. How old is too old? Too old to learn Spanish? Too old to dance again? Too old to say I love you without choking on decades of regret? Because the moment a man says, I'm too old for that, he's not commenting on his age. He's announcing his resignation from aliveness. And here's the twisted humor of it all. The people who say they're too old usually aren't old enough to be dead. They're just uncomfortable being beginners again. I knew a guy named Bill, retired at 67, spent 3 years saying he was going to start woodworking. But every time he passed the community college where they held night classes, he'd mutter, I'm too old to be sitting in a classroom full of kids. So instead, he sat at home, watched the Weather Channel, told himself that being realistic was a virtue. One day I asked him, what's stopping you? He said, at my age, what's the point? That was the last conversation we had before he died. And you know what stuck with me? Not the regret, but the politeness of it, how casually he gave up on himself. In Buddhism, we talk a lot about impermanence. Everything changes, nothing lasts. Even this body, just a rental. But that doesn't mean you stop showing up. Thich Nhat Hanh once said, the present moment is the only moment available to us, and it is the door to all moments. Translation, it's not too late until your breath says so. And guess what? If you're watching this, you're still breathing. Psychologists have noticed that men over 60 sometimes carry around quiet grief like a second shadow. Grief for time lost, for bodies that ache, for dreams left untouched. So they say, I'm too old. Not because they believe it, but because it hurts too much to imagine what could have been if they started earlier. But here's the secret. It's not about starting early. It's about starting anyway. I once met a 72-year-old man in Chiang Mai who took up belly dancing. Not for fitness, not for TikTok, just because it made him feel ridiculous and alive. He told me, at my age, nobody expects anything from me, which means I finally get to surprise myself. That's not just rebellion, that's spiritual freedom. The phrase, I'm too old for that, is a velvet rope you put around your own potential. It keeps you from the dance floor of life because you're afraid of looking foolish. But listen to me, brother. You've earned the right to look foolish. You've earned the right to try, fail, laugh, and try again. Because wisdom isn't knowing when to quit, it's knowing when to begin again. A phrase that sounds harmless but buries more potential than any other. I'll do it later. Let's go dig that one up from its graveyard of good intentions. Part 6, I'll do it later. The most spiritual way to say, I plan to regret this eventually. Let's not sugarcoat it. I'll do it later is the most well-dressed excuse in human history. It wears a tie. It sounds responsible. It nods politely and whispers, you're not saying no, you're just postponing greatness until you're less tired, less scared, less mortal. And then, one day, later runs out, and you're left standing at the edge of your own life with a to-do list full of things that could have saved you if only you had done them while you were still breathing. A man I knew, let's call him Thomas, kept every intention in the tomorrow folder. He'd call his brother when things slowed down. He'd take that writing class once the weather got better. He'd forgive himself. Just not today. Then one day, his brother died. The folder was still full. I saw it after the funeral. Emails he never finished, letters he never mailed, things he meant to say stacked like tombstones in his outbox. If hell exists, I imagine it looks like an inbox of unread apologies and unsaid love. Procrastination isn't always laziness. For aging men, it's often avoidance dressed up as logic. The brain, facing mortality, pulls a neat little trick. If I delay it, I don't have to face how much time I've already lost. But the longer you wait to start, the heavier the weight becomes, until you're not procrastinating anymore. You're grieving things you never even gave yourself permission to attempt. Marcus Aurelius, who walked the Stoic path with one sandal in Buddhist territory, said, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do, say, and think." The Buddha would agree. He taught Maranasati, the mindfulness of death, not as a scare tactic, but as a motivator. A reminder that the only time we ever have to be alive is now. Not after lunch, not next Tuesday. Not when your sciatica calms down, now. I once had a closet labeled one-day projects. You know the type. Old photos I was going to sort, books I was going to read, letters I was going to write. 10 years later, it'd become a shrine to future regret. You know what finally made me clean it out? A dream where my dead uncle pointed at it and said, "So this is where your joy went to die." I woke up laughing and then crying, and then I got to work. The phrase, "I'll do it later," sounds harmless, but it's actually the softest kind of self-abandonment. An intelligent man doesn't wait for the perfect moment. He knows it doesn't exist. Instead, he makes a call now. He forgives now. He starts badly now. Because imperfect now beats perfect never every damn time. The most seductive sentence men use to justify emotional stuntedness, bad behavior, and spiritual stagnation: "That's just how I am, oh buddy. Buckle up." Part 7, "That's just how I am." Also known as, "Please excuse me while I stay emotionally unavailable forever." Ah yes, that's just how I am. The verbal equivalent of a sigh and a shrug. It's the kind of sentence you say when you want people to stop expecting you to grow. It's not a personality trait, it's an escape plan with mood lighting. You'll hear it in all the classics. "I'm just blunt. I don't do emotions. I've always been like this." You know who else says that? Stubborn grandfathers, men at the DMV, and emotionally constipated spiritual seekers. There was a man, let's call him Martin, who prided himself on being direct, which, in his case, meant rude with a side of overconfidence. He lost 3 friends in 1 year. They said he was hard to talk to. He said they were too sensitive. I once asked him if he thought maybe he could soften his tone. He said, "That's just how I am." A year later, he was eating dinner alone, still blaming the world for walking away from a man who hadn't updated his emotional software since 1991. In psychology, we call this identity foreclosure, locking into a sense of self too early and refusing to renegotiate. It's often driven by fear. Fear that if you change, you'll lose yourself. Fear that if you admit you could be better, maybe you weren't so great to begin with. But here's the thing, you are not a museum exhibit. You're a living system, and living systems adapt or they decay. The Buddha taught anatta, no fixed self, meaning, who you are is not some solid object locked in place. It's a process, a verb, a dance of causes and conditions. When you say, "That's just how I am," you're denying the very nature of life itself, change. You might as well yell at a river for flowing. I used to be the guy who said, "I'm just a night owl," which was great. Until I realized I was mostly just avoiding quiet time and late-night anxiety with snacks and reruns. One day someone asked me, "Do you like staying up late, or are you just uncomfortable being alone with your thoughts?" And I thought, wow, how dare you tell me the truth so gently. Turns out, "That's just how I am" was a shield I was using to avoid sitting with the parts of myself I hadn't befriended yet. If you've said "that's just how I am" recently, pause. Ask yourself, is that true? Or is it just easier than changing? Because you're not a finished product, you're an unfolding mystery. An old dog who absolutely can learn new tricks if he'd stop insisting that he's already house-trained. Growth doesn't mean you were wrong before. It means you're brave enough to meet who you are now. Just when you thought we were done, we've got 2 bonus phrases that are even sneakier. One sounds noble, but it rots your soul. The other sounds wise, but it ruins relationships before they start. Let's start with the one that turns man to a spiritual diva. I deserve better. Get ready. Part 8. I deserve better. A surprisingly sophisticated way to stay bitter until you die alone. Holding a grudge like it's a teddy bear. Ah, the sweet sound of spiritual ego. I deserve better. It sounds empowered, doesn't it? Like you've done the work. Like you finally stood up for yourself. But here's the twist. Sometimes when a man says this, what he actually means is, "I don't want to feel the discomfort of being human anymore. so I'm going to declare myself above it all and pout with dignity. It's a mood. I once met a man in his 70s who said this exact phrase to me over lunch. He was talking about his family, his friends, even his dentist. After everything I've done, I deserve better than this. He had raised kids, worked hard, stayed married for 30 years before his wife passed. And yes, he had done a lot. But somewhere along the way, he confused being good with being owed. What he didn't realize was, the moment you start keeping emotional score, you've stopped showing up with love and started doing math no one else agreed to. According to psychologists, entitlement in aging men often masks unresolved grief. You weren't seen. You weren't appreciated. You weren't rewarded. So now you want life to pay you back, with perfect respect, easy relationships, and grandchildren who call without being bribed. But here's the problem. Life isn't a vending machine. You don't insert virtue and get back hugs. And the more you expect the world to validate your pain, the more you end up disappointed, isolated, and slightly insufferable. In Buddhist practice, the idea of deserving is a trap. It binds us to attachment, to outcomes, to this belief that because we've suffered or done the right thing, we should be rewarded. But the Dharma doesn't promise you a trophy. It offers freedom, if you're willing to let go. Thich Nhat Hanh put it simply, the most precious gift we can offer anyone is our presence. Not our resume, not our righteousness, our presence. I once sat in a Sangha circle with a guy who said, dead serious, "I've meditated every day for 3 years. My wife still doesn't appreciate me. I deserve better." I nearly choked on my ginger tea. Brother, you've spent 3 years training your mind and you still think enlightenment comes with applause? You don't meditate for compliments. You meditate so that not getting them doesn't ruin your day. You deserve to be free. There's a difference. Intelligent men eventually learn that the greatest peace doesn't come from demanding better treatment. It comes from releasing the scorecard, from showing up without needing to be worshipped for it. You're not here to collect loyalty points. You're here to love, to serve, to be surprised. And the moment you let go of what you deserve is the moment life starts offering you something even deeper. Grace, the final bonus phrase. This one sounds like wisdom, but underneath it's a relationship killer. People don't change. Let's dismantle that little lie next. Part 9. People don't change. A great way to stay lonely, suspicious, and right, but mostly just lonely. You've heard it. You've probably said it. People don't change. It's a sentence that makes you sound like you've been around the block, like you've seen too much, like you've graduated from the school of hard knocks with a PhD in cynicism. But here's the real translation. I've been hurt. I haven't healed. So now I wrap my heart in bubble wrap and call it wisdom. Spoiler alert, it's not wisdom. It's protective bitterness with good PR. I once had a neighbor, let's call him Roy. Nice guy, quiet, lost his wife early, never remarried, didn't talk much. One day we were watching the mailman trip over a kid's scooter, and Roy said out of nowhere, "People don't change. That's why I stopped expecting anything from them." And just like that, I understood his whole life. Why he didn't call his son, why he sat alone every Christmas, why his dog was the only one who got a good morning greeting. He wasn't cold, he was frozen in disappointment. According to psychology, the belief that people don't change often comes from a history of betrayal, abandonment, or unresolved emotional trauma. It's a way to avoid future pain by expecting nothing at all. But here's the rub. When you stop believing people can grow, you quietly stop believing that you can, too. And that's not intelligence. That's a slow-motion resignation letter to life. Buddhism teaches anicca, impermanence. Nothing stays the same. Not your body, not your beliefs, not the guy who wronged you in 1993. People change. Not always the way we want, not always on our timeline, but change is baked into existence. Even a single breath shifts the body. Even a moment of silence shifts the heart. To say people don't change is to ignore everything the universe keeps screaming softly. Look again. Everything is already different. I had a friend, let's call him Dave. Back in the day, Dave was a grade A egomaniac with a Bluetooth headset and a cologne trail that lingered like bad karma. But something happened. His mom got sick, his wife left, he lost a job he thought defined him. And little by little, he changed. He started asking questions. He cried once, in front of people, and didn't make a joke to cover it up. He showed up at my door one day and said, "Hey, I know I've been a self-centered ass for most of our friendship. Can I start over?" If I'd held on to "people don't change," I would have missed the man he was becoming. And that would have been a loss for both of us. When you stop believing in change, you stop showing up. You stop listening. You stop forgiving. You stop offering space for growth. And let me tell you, the world doesn't need more bitter old men. It needs elders. Men who've seen suffering and stayed open anyway. Men who say, "I've been hurt, but I'll keep hoping. I've seen the worst, but I'll still bless the best when it shows up." Because the intelligent man doesn't expect people to be perfect. He expects them to be possible. So, which one got you today? Was it the polite lie of "I'll do it later"? The quiet arrogance of "I already know that"? Or maybe that sneaky little trap called "That's just how I am," spoken like a man married to his bad habits and calling it personality? Wherever it landed, don't worry, you're not broken. You're just unfinished. Like all wise things, you're still steeping. A little softer, a little quieter, a little more curious. That's the good news. Because intelligent men don't just age, they shed. They let go of the words that close doors and choose the ones that keep the heart open. So if you found even one sentence here that made you laugh, think, or whisper, "Damn, that's me," then you've already started changing. Before you go, do us a small kindness. Like the video, leave a comment, tell us which phrase you're retiring, subscribe, and help us reach 1,000 gentle rebels who'd rather grow old with grace than die, proving a point. And remember, next time your ego says, say it, pause, smile, and maybe say nothing at all. We'll see you in the next one. Keep your tea warm and your mind open.